Well, howdy, intrepid internet video viewer. My name is Corey Wakefield, and I've got another header and footer builder video for you guys today. We're going to chat a little bit about partials, and more specifically the anchor partial, and even more specifically, what in the world is a partial? Because I know that you've probably heard this term from the general overview video, and maybe it's been floating around in a few spots, but you're wondering, what is that? And, I kind of realized, I actually want to go back and revisit that idea a little bit more in some videos, because I think it'll actually help you guys see how things really tie together in the builder if you haven't already kind of maybe subconsciously seen a few of these patterns playing out already. So, partials, what are they? It's kind of a word we came up with to represent any reusable bit of markup, scripting, or styling that we were using between different elements. So, if there was an element we designed that everything was totally unique to that element, that's its own thing. But if we had this little bit of reusable code, we could kind of drop in like little Lego bricks from piece to piece. That became a partial for us. So one of the first partials we came up with was this anchor partial. And it really started as anything that was a link. So, buttons, menu items, whether in the top level or the sub level. But ultimately, it also came to represent kind of anything that physically might have the appearance of a button or that you would interact with to toggle something else on or off. So anchors, as they stand right now, currently represent buttons, toggles, and menu item links. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this anchor partial, and you've probably already kind of recognized this a little bit, but we're just going to jump right in here and show you what that means. And really, if I could sum it up in one word, what that does mean is greater consistency for you all, which I think ultimately means faster build times, because as you move between element to element, you'll have a greater understanding of what to expect and know when you're building things out. So we've got this button here, and if we look at this, our setting navigation up here, we've got 5 groups. So we've got our setup, design, text, graphic, and interactions. Similarly, if I click onto my collapse nav and click on the toggle here, we've got those exact same 5 groups of settings. And if I click on my inline nav and go to my top links, we've got the same thing. Now we have one extra group here, this sub indicator, and this is the first important concept to kind of touch on, but that is that some partials will have a few different controls based on their context that they're used in. So for example, the anchor is 95% the same controls from element to element. But when I'm using it as a menu item, a pretty common pattern for menus when we have sublinks is we want to somehow indicate to the user that there's a little something more there they might want to explore. So we have included this sub indicator piece of markup in that partial, this anchor partial. And when you're using it as a menu item, you have access to it to style. You don't need that in a button, because a button isn't, it doesn't have nested content that you need to access. However, there are a few little differences, not on that macro level, but in a more micro sense sometimes too. So if I go to the button and turn this graphic on, we've got 2 options here. We can choose between an icon, represented by the little font awesome flag, or we can use an image. Well, if I click over to my toggle here, select that, and go to my graphic, you'll see I've got 3 options now. So we have the same font awesome icon, an image, or this hamburger option, which really represents the idea of a toggle. So these toggles are things we built that you can tweak and style, and they're a little more interactive, and they're great for things like the drop downs and the off canvas stuff. So you have the choice of a burger, the classic burger. We've got this grid option. We've also got the what we're kind of calling the more toggle, and we have a horizontal and vertical version of that. So you will occasionally have a few little subtle differences like that too, but the biggest thing to keep in mind is just as you work your way through these modules, there's nothing you'll ever miss if you're just taking it piece by piece. But for the most part, they're 95 to 100% the same from element to element. So let me click back to my button here. Make that an icon one more time. And I'm going to go to, I'm just going to start from the setup, and we're just going to work our way down the line. So the point of this video is not to get into super nitty gritty detail or, a lot of like tips and tricks on things, but I will be just kind of explaining how certain things are set up and why they're there and how you might want to use them as you design your pages. So for our setup, we have our base font size, which is setting up, just like it says, the base font size for that item. Keep in mind, and this is important for everything here, keep in mind that you are styling the individual link. So for these menu items, when you're styling those, you're actually setting the base font size on the menu item itself, not like on the menu and then kind of styling it. So just keep that in mind. I'll actually show you a little trick here in a second that you can use that's really cool. So we've got that base font size. We've got our dimensions. So, if we wanted to play with saying my button should be at least 300 pixels wide, you can play with all those dimensions and get things perfectly right. And then our background. Now, not everything will have a link. Really only the button and the social element have a link because you can specify it in line. Toggles, at least as they stand right now, don't ever have a need for a link because you're always bringing in a new piece of content. And then for menus, you won't see a link because that link is populated from the backend, the WordPress menu system. If we go back to buttons and hop over to design, the flex layout, the content flex layout is doing just that. It's specifying how you want the content of your anchor to behave. So you'll notice if I click reverse layout, the icon and the text in my button have swapped places. Or if I do a column layout, they're now on top of one another and I can reverse those back. Similarly, if you have a full height anchor, such as these links right here, we could go to the design. Got it right here. And we could vertically orient our content towards the top, at the bottom. We can play around with lots of different little ideas. And if you haven't seen the Flexbox tips and tricks video we did, definitely check that out. There's a lot of great info in there on how all this stuff kind of works on a more fundamental level. So going back to our button, we can, of course, adjust all of these granular options. So margin is, of course, our spacing between items. We've got our padding, borders. Regarding this, again, like I said earlier, keep in mind that you're styling each individual item. So a cool trick you might want to do is, let's say on this menu, I wanted to have a look where I had a kind of a border on either side of the link item. Well, the way you might do that is you might say, okay, well, I'll unlink this and I'll add a right border. Make it 1 pixel. We'll make it kind of a light gray. Oops. Make it a little lighter there. And then, you might add a border on the other side and make it solid and add the same color. Okay, and you're really close. But you'll notice that, since we're styling each item, there's like a double pixel border here because these are butted up against one another. And on the outside, you've got that 1 pixel. And there's, like a lot of things in the builder, there's many different ways you could accomplish this. You could actually style the container itself. If you just put a container around the menu, and you could give that container, borders on certain sides and then play with the borders on the menu items. But another way you might do it is, and I actually think I need to set up my menu items like this first with the fill space there. But I could come to this design, and now I might just say, okay, so to the side, since I got borders on either side, I'm just going to do -1 pixel. Okay, so look at that. So now what we've done is we've gotten rid of that double border because each of these menu items now is getting pulled to the right by 1 pixel, -1 pixel. So they're kind of overlapping each other now. And that's what it will enable you to get that 1 pixel border between each one. But you've assigned a pixel border to each side. So keep that in mind too. There's lots of, you have access to these very kind of low-level controls, and sometimes it's just a kind of creative approach to how you use those to get certain looks. So just keep that in mind when you're playing around with some of those items there. Then of course we have border radius, so we can play with the overall shape of our button, and you can do some really fun stuff too if you were to unlink this and maybe one side, make it a 0, or you just play with a little bit of a border there. Actually probably needs a little more since that other side is so big. But yeah, anyway, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do playing, unlinking stuff and playing with certain sides. Let's see there. All sorts of funky shapes. So just fun stuff to play around with. We've got our box shadow, which you have full control to every parameter of that box shadow. And this little control right here has to do, if you haven't found out already, whether it is going to be an outside box shadow or if it's going to be inset inside your button. So that gives a totally different look based on how you want to set all that up. And then regarding this right here, base and interaction, you'll see this a lot. So anything that's a link, and sometimes in other instances, but you'll see this base and interaction. That essentially means, what is the base style for that button when I'm just looking at it, and then what do I want it to do when I interact with it, whether that is focusing with a keyboard or hovering with a mouse or touching it on a phone. So for example, right here we've got a little bit of a lighter red background for our base, and then it's slightly darker for that interaction style. So that just means whether I were to hover over it or focus with a keyboard, that dark color will come in on that interaction state. And what's nice about that is it simplifies things greatly. So that also acts as kind of your active state. So you don't have to be thinking about, hover, focus, active, all these things. You just kind of set these two styles, and that gives you a lot of control right there. We do have our text set up, so you can turn text on or off. So for example, if you wanted an icon only button, you could do that. And you can play with stuff too, like if the sizing wasn't quite right, you could remove the padding around here, and then you could give the button the same height and width, and that would give you a full, true circle button, but that actually looks pretty good right there. So we'll turn this back on. You have access to 2 lines of text. So we could add about the team in here. And we see that appearing right up there. And we can reverse that order. So the secondary can go above or below that text. And then we can adjust the spacing between that text. So if I were to make that 85, it's a little bit bigger. We want that a little closer. Now this text margin here, you will actually see this at the kind of beginning of each text graphic. Got our graphic margin or the sub indicator section. And what that really means is that is saying, so around all your text, so whether you have 1 line of text or 2, so around all this text, do you want to add a little bit of margin to space things out? So what we typically do in our presets is we put this 4 pixel border around here, and that is so if you all are playing with these layouts and you switch to column, let me get if you switch to column, you'll see there's a little bit of spacing in there still. So we do 4 pixels on all sides because it gives a little bit of a buffer. Really what you probably want to do, if you know exactly what you want to do with your design, is start from 0 and really just adjust that in the direction you need. So for example, if I was using this layout, I might just want to put a little bit of pixel margin on the top, and that is spacing my text away from the icon there and giving me that orientation that I want. It's also really important for things like, for example, some bits of text their line heights are a little bit different from font to font, or maybe the icon you've chosen is, the vertical alignment of it is a little off just because of the way the icon was designed. So what's nice about that too is you could come in here and specify, you could come on just to the bottom and say, well, maybe I need to bump that text up, 2 pixels just to get it just right. It's a very subtle thing, but it's something that's really important, for especially people who just all those little details really matter. We wanted to make sure we give you, that full control without having to go into a style sheet and adjust something because, maybe the font you chose doesn't quite line up with a graphic you're using or something like that. So we do have our text formatting controls, which you're probably familiar with from other aspects in different elements. You have full access to everything here. So font family and weight, which we will talk about these controls in a little more detail in another video because they tie into how you set up your font templates. But you can also set up your font size, letter spacing, the line height, normal italic. You can do your alignment here. Now, if I add in my about the team text here a little bit, oops, I hit enter too fast. About the team. Keeps wanting to move me back there. Got a dev branch up right now, so things are kind of moving around on me. This is where you can play with how stuff interacts. So for example, notice I've got both of these bits of text centered. If I take that off, these will now appear kind of left aligned up against that icon. If you swapped the icon to the other side and you wanted it to be right aligned, you could play with that. So play with how these interact with one another in terms of your text alignments and those sort of things. You can also, of course, work on transforms if you need it, colors, all that stuff is available. And these secondary text options will not show up if you don't have anything in here. So if this is empty, or if you're on a menu item, let me hop over here. If you have these on or off. So again, just like your link is populated from the menu system in the back end, this text and this icon, those elements are all pulled from the WP menu system because there's not a way to access each individual item and specify the text and icons or design elements. That's all pulled through dynamically. So all you can really do here is turn that on or off after you've set it in the back end. Then we will move on to our graphic next. So we already talked about this a little bit, but you can specify graphic on or off, and you can go between an icon or an image. You'll see those options swap out over here. Same thing, we've got our graphic margin. So this is the margin around whatever graphic you've chosen, and you can make that as big or little or non-existent as you want it to be. With graphics and images, keep in mind that you have this idea of a secondary graphic or image. So for example, if I just hover over my button here, you'll see that icon stays right there. And actually, let me change this to white so we can see that change a little more drastically. So all that's really happening there is I'm allowing the color or the text shadow, if I've added it, to change when I interact with that button. If I turn on this secondary option, I have access to another icon here. And so what's really cool is I can either leave it the same, and which doesn't really do much there, but it will do something with these interactions we'll talk about in a second. But if I pick a different icon, so let me just, let's do a Spock. Now if I hover, you'll notice one fade in and the other one fade out. Now and the color is changing, right? Now I can also pair it with these interactions. So I might want to have it flip on hover. So now there's a lot going on here. So now we've got on hover, it's turning white, and it's also flipping and transitioning to that secondary icon that I've chosen. We'll just bump this up slightly so we can see it a little more. So very cool effect. And kind of what I was saying earlier is you could actually pick the same icon and you could turn this flip effect on if you just wanted to have the flip with the same icon. And similarly, this interaction, if we turn this off, you can still leave flip on, but it will behave slightly differently. It kind of animates in from a zero opacity because you only have one icon to work with there. So just a little bit going on there. And similarly, you can do the same with an image. You can turn on a secondary image and you can have that swap out. And actually, I'm going to go grab a couple images really fast. I need to stop the video for a second and come right back and show this example off here. All right, we are back in action. So I wanted to take a moment. I realized I forgot to upload some images I wanted to use for this example. But if we select our image option here, we can select an option, and we can also turn on a secondary image. We've got our little bored guy and our happy guy here. And same thing, that graphic animation will apply to your image as well. So when I hover over my button, again, not only are my colors and everything else that I'm doing my interaction styles changing on, but also my images too. So this is a great little effect to use if you've got some images like this that pair well. And a thing to keep in mind is you will always want to make sure that you use images of the same size because, for example, with this retina control, you can use this to toggle on and off if you want. So that's the original size of my image, 64 pixels. But I have retina turned on so it's sharp on like a MacBook Pro or anything with a high pixel density screen. And both of these are 32 pixels because I need those to match so that they will flip around there properly. So, and there's a few different effects you can play around with here. Each one has their own kind of look. And you can, of course, just set it to none if you would like them to fade and go between each other like that. So, or we can just add our image and have colors change. So keep that in mind when you're playing around with things. You can achieve kind of some similar effects if you choose icons that are of a similar kind of style. For example, you might look for circle, if I can spell it. Click on that. And then maybe we do a checkbox here. So when I hover, that circle fills in with the icon there. And again, we can play around with some different animations on how that appears in. So lots of, thinking of how you use shapes, images, colors, all of that stuff kind of works together and with these interactions to give you a particular look. So play around with that. And a lot of times you'll find too that simpler is oftentimes better as you just allow a few things to kind of change. When everything kind of changes all the time, sometimes it can be a little drastic, but of course it's totally up to whatever the vision is you're trying to accomplish there. So let's jump over here for a second because we've got our sub indicator to chat about. So this is very similar to the graphic. You can basically turn it on or off in your menu. You do have a little bit of margin around it you can play with. You have your text shadow because it is an icon, so we can style that. You can specify the size of it. And you can give it a height or width if you need to. This is added because for a few different scenarios. So for example, if you had, sometimes these icons will get cut off a little bit because you'll see like this envelope is slightly wider than these more square versions. And this actually looks fine right now, but using IMs and non-pixel values can sometimes give you a little bit of that. So occasionally setting, a width on it might ensure that you always have enough space for that full icon to show. It's also really good for, stay here. That's not what I want to do. Let's say I add a collapse navigation to my sidebar here. And I'm going to go to my top links here. I will turn a graphic on. And you will notice here that if I took this width out, do you see how all of these text items have kind of lined up, differently according to the width of that icon. So to get that uniform look that we want vertically on these icons, if we just add a value there, we can ensure that we always, because now this icon is occupying a 1em width space. So all that text is lined up perfectly, no matter how big or little we make that space. So that's another trick to kind of keep in mind too. And you can use those different heights and things to play around with how you orient stuff. But that's a really important trick, especially for things that are vertically aligned like this, and you might need it to be set up just right. Another really important trick to keep in mind with your sub indicators, and really with your graphics even too if you want, is this auto trick, this margin auto. So if you want to push something all the way to the side of your anchor, for example, how this sub indicator is pushed all the way to the side, you want to specify an auto margin either on the, for example here, the left side of this anchor or the right side of this text. So on this text, on my right side, I have margin auto, and you can see if I just go back to 5 pixels, what it's going to do is center everything. Now, why I've put auto on here is because it will push all of these items, even if they don't have a sub indicator, over to the left. If I put the 5 pixels back here and went to my sub indicator, and then I put auto on the left, again, we're seeing that only this one is getting pushed aside because this sub indicator only exists right here. So this takes a little bit of just kind of playing around with, and again, it's whatever the kind of design goal you're trying to achieve. But auto will push that aside. Similarly, if we turned our sub indicator off, let's say we just had a top level menu, we could go back to our text, and now we could either do 5 pixels here and center everything now, or we could come over to our left side and do auto and push that icon away, and now we've got a cool look here where our icons are all aligned and our text is aligned to the side here. And so all these little things kind of add up. There's a lot to kind of play around with. And again, notice if we do the auto width, now our icons are truly pushed all the way to the side, versus a 1em width kind of ensures they're all aligned evenly like that. So lots of little nuances to play with and looks to achieve that are really just up to you and what the goal is you're trying to accomplish. So we'll get rid of that bar. Jump back over here. And last but not least, we have our interactions. So we have a lot more text interactions than we do graphic stuff, but these were designed to just add a little bit of flair for you guys to play around with if you want it. And again, keep in mind that a lot of times with these things, subtlety is always a little better. So you typically turning everything on might look, a little funky, but you of course are perfectly fine to do that if you like. But it works great having it as just a subtle effect here or there. So for example, I might have on my top level menu items here, if I go over to interactions, I could turn on, let's say, again, this is my text, and I'll say slide from bottom. So now when I hover over these, we get just a little bit of an animation of our text kind of animating in. Now I picked from bottom because if I did from right per se, you might end up with text running into an icon or a sub indicator. That actually looks pretty good, but lots of stuff to play with there. You can also do this scale up. We've got the scale down, and then we have the same thing with flip X and Y, so your text can kind of animate in. Now one thing to keep in mind too is with this secondary text, you'll see that second line kind of gets a little bit of a delay, and that's just a nice, again, little thing we take care of behind the scenes. That just works really nicely. If you just have the primary text, that will just animate in right away there. Similarly with our graphic, you saw that earlier that we have a few different animation styles. And what I was showing you earlier too is these will change slightly depending on if you have secondary turned on or off, and that's for the icon or the image. So right now I've got scale up happening, and you'll notice that it's on a transition whenever I hover in or hover out. If I turn secondary off, I get that scale up effect, but it's just scaling up my primary icon. And what it kind of does, now it's using an animation similar to the animations for this text. So it will kind of fade out to opacity and then fade in while it scales up. So just a slightly different little nuance there. Again, if I flip X, I'll get the flip, but I kind of fade out first and then fade in. Whereas if I turn my secondary icon on, now I'm getting kind of a flip as I move in and out of the button. So it's happening more in real time. And then last but not least, and I'm going to do a much more detailed video on these particles at another time. But these particles here, if you, actually I'll hop over to my menu item. Go to interactions. So again, you can turn these particles on or off right here. So I have my primary particle on, so I get these two new settings at the end. And I'm going to do a whole video on these, but these have to do with allowing you to, so this red line up here, those different looks are what that particle allows you to do. And there is all sorts of stuff you guys can create with that little feature. It really came out of our desire to, we knew we wanted to give you all the ability to make, I mean, tons of different menu styles and hover styles, and in different contexts like buttons and in your navigations and your toggles. But we didn't want to just put in, 50, 60, 100 different styles, because that's just a lot of bloat kind of sitting in your style sheet that maybe you're only using one, maybe you're not even using one at all. So having this abstract little feature, this particle, allows you to really do all sorts of cool stuff. So for example, this effect right here on the toggle, you see that kind of wave effect where the gray circle expands and then the white comes back in. That is actually using two particles with a little bit of a delay, gives a cool effect. This red line is a particle. So anyway, I will go into more detail in that, or on that, in a separate video, because there's a lot to touch on there. But just keep in mind that that is part of your anchors at the very end on your buttons, toggles, and menu items. And really turning them on, just like you see here and here, there's a different context. If we play around with, let's just turn that sub-menu icon or sub-menu particle on. So now I've got, again, a little red line kind of coming in from the side. There's so much we can do with this, not just lines, not just circles, but all sorts of cool stuff. So we will go into that in a little more detail in another video. But I think for now, that primarily covers everything regarding anchors. Again, we'll probably do a video that maybe goes into some tips and tricks on anchors, but this does show a few primary uses of different things and kind of explains how all these little pieces to the puzzle fit together and how you might want to use them. So that is the anchor partial, and thank you guys very much for watching.